All right, let's jump right in. We are about to explore a version of Jesus Christ's story that I guarantee is not the one you heard growing up. It's a compelling and honestly pretty radical narrative that comes from one of America's most documented psychics, a man named Edgar Cayce. So let's just start with the big question that sits at the heart of all this. What if the story of Jesus, who he was, what he taught, and why he was here, is infinitely bigger and more profound than the one we've all been told? So where does this wild story come from? It all comes from Edgar Cayce, a fascinating figure known as the sleeping prophet. Now, Cayce would put himself into a trance, and in that state, he delivered thousands of what he called readings on everything you can imagine, health, history, you name it. And a huge part of that was a completely different take on the life of Jesus.
So how did he supposedly get this information? Well, Cayce claimed he was tapping into something called the Akashic Records. Think of it like a cosmic internet or a spiritual cloud server, a universal library that holds the complete record of every single thought, emotion, and experience of every soul that has ever existed. Wild stuff.
And this is where we get to the absolute core of Cayce's teachings on this topic. It's a total reimagining of what Jesus' divinity actually means. It shifts the entire focus from a savior who is out there to a potential that lies deep within every single one of us. The key idea here is something called Christ consciousness. According to Cayce, this isn't a state that belonged exclusively to Jesus. No, it's the divine spark, that deep awareness of our own connection to the universal source, to God. And that spark, that potential, exists inside every single human soul. And this really breaks it down perfectly. The view many of us grew up with is that Jesus was the divine exception, a one-time, unrepeatable event. But in Cayce's readings, he's presented as the divine blueprint. He's the one who showed us the pattern, the path that every soul is ultimately meant to follow. He wasn't the exception, he was the example. Okay, so this brings us to one of the biggest mysteries in the Gospels, the so-called lost years. You know, that huge 18-year gap between Jesus as a boy in the temple and when he starts his public ministry. Well, Cayce's readings claim to fill in that gap with an absolutely incredible story. According to Cayce, Jesus didn't just stay in Nazareth being a carpenter. He traveled the world. He went to Egypt to study in the ancient mystery schools. He journeyed to India to learn from the great masters of the East. He went to Persia to deepen his wisdom. This wasn't just some gap year, it was a period of intense training to awaken that Christ consciousness within himself and master the universal laws that he would later demonstrate as miracles. And this preparation wasn't just happening with him. Cayce's readings put a huge emphasis on a mystical Jewish community called the Essenes. He claimed they spent generations, we're talking centuries, purifying their lineage and practicing spiritual disciplines, all to prepare the way for a soul pure enough to fully embody the Christ. So in this version, Jesus' birth wasn't an accident. It was the incredible culmination of a multi-generational spiritual project.
Now, this is where things get even more challenging for traditional beliefs. According to Cayce, Jesus didn't just understand the concept of reincarnation, he actually taught it.
And this quote from the readings just hits it right on the head. The difference between Jesus and you or me wasn't one of kind, but of development. We all have the same spiritual DNA, the same divine potential. He had just spent many, many lifetimes perfecting his soul and awakening that potential to its fullest. In fact, Cayce went so far as to identify previous lifetimes of the soul we know as Jesus. He pointed to major biblical figures like Adam, Enoch, Melchizedek, and Joshua. Each life was another step, another lesson learned on this massive cosmic journey to become the perfect vehicle for the Christ consciousness. So you have to ask, right? If these teachings were so fundamental, where did they go? Well, according to Cayce, as the early church grew from a spiritual movement into a powerful institution, Jesus' original empowering message was intentionally edited and altered. Cayce often pointed to pivotal moments in history like the Council of Nicaea back in 325 CE. He claimed it was at councils like this where critical decisions were made, decisions that favored creating a unified dogma, establishing institutional control, and maintaining power rather than promoting individual spiritual freedom and direct experience of the divine. So what kind of stuff got left on the cutting room floor? Well, things like reincarnation, the idea of using meditation to connect directly with God yourself. And most importantly, the core teaching that we all have this divine potential inside of us. And you can see why, right? If you believe these things, you don't really need a priest or an institution to act as a middleman between you and God. It empowers you directly. To make this super clear, Cayce drew a line between the Jesus consciousness and the Christ consciousness. Jesus was the man, the human personality who was wise and compassionate and walked the roads of Galilee. But the Christ consciousness is the universal, fully awakened divine awareness that he embodied. That's the part that's accessible to every single one of us.
So what's the point of all this? This isn't just some weird alternative history. The whole point of Cayce's readings is to completely shift how we see ourselves and our own spiritual journey.
And this lays out the two paths so clearly. You can have a religion about Jesus, which is focused on belief, on worship, and usually requires an intermediary. Or you can follow the path of Jesus, which, according to Cayce, is all about practice, emulation, and finding that direct connection for yourself. It's a fundamental shift from just worshiping him to actively trying to awaken what he awakened in himself.
And really, this is the final takeaway. According to Cayce, by making Jesus this singular, untouchable divine figure to be worshipped from afar, the most important message got lost. The greatest secret that was hidden wasn't about who he was. It was about who we are and what we all have the potential to become.
And that brings us right back to these incredible words spoken by Jesus himself. Cayce was adamant that this wasn't just a nice metaphor. He insisted it was a literal promise, a statement of fact about the immense, divine potential that is sleeping inside every single one of us, just waiting to be realized. At the end of the day, Cayce's entire sprawling narrative really boils down to this one simple, earth-shattering idea. That maybe the greatest secret of all was never really a secret. Maybe it was just hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to finally understand what it truly means.